Creepshow 2 is a horror anthology film and is of course the sequel to the successful Creepshow. This is the second collaboration between Stephen King and George A. Romero, as they worked together on Creepshow 5 years earlier. Creepshow 2 was released on the 1st of May 1987. With a budget of just $3.5 million and a box office return of $14 million, technically the film was a financial success, but was panned by many as an inferior sequel. As before, the film pays homage to the EC horror comics of the 50s. For this sequel, George A. Romero adapts the screenplay from King's work, and the directing duties are handed over to Michael Gornick, who was the cinematographer on the first Creepshow. With this entry we are given 3 tales of horror, however it was intended to be 5 like his predecessor, but due to budgetary constraints 2 of them had to be scrapped. Each of them were titled Pinfall and Cat from Hell, of which the latter is based on King's own short story which was published in March 1977. Cat from Hell would eventually be seen in Tales from the Dark Side the movie in 1990, of which itself was rumoured to have originally been intended as Creepshow 3, however there is no real evidence to support the rumour. Pinfall never went past the writing stage, but was originally intended to be the second story in Creepshow 2. However, the segment was eventually intended to be used in a future sequel to Tales from the Dark Side the movie, which itself never came to fruition. The film begins, and from a distance there is a truck pulling up to the roadside which is situated in a small American town. There is a child on a bike who rides up and stops behind the truck. The child is Billy from the first film. Up close we can see the license plate of the truck stating Maine, Creep. There is strange giggling coming from inside the rear of the truck. The rear of the truck opens where a ghoulish looking man turns round putting down a tied brown package. He smiles at an eager Billy. While pointing to the package he says creepily, "I've never seen anyone so impatient, Billy, as if your life depended on getting the first copy of the presses." The creep then throws the package on the floor in front of an amazed Billy. He then puts his hands out as though to cast a spell and the world becomes animated. The package is ripped open by tiny flying demons to reveal a batch of Creepshow comics. Billy runs over to the comics. The creep giggles as he jumps out of the truck and disappears, but not before revealing to Billy he was the creep all along. Billy rubs his eye in surprise to what he's just seen. He then picks up the latest issue of Creepshow and starts to read, and that's when the stories begin. The creep introduces each story, and the first is titled Old Chief Woodenhead. The story is about aging shopkeeper Ray Spruce and his wife Martha, who live in a small run-down town called Dead River. They are visited by Native American elder Benjamin Whitemoon, who entrusts Ray with his tribe's sacred treasure until their debt with them is paid in full. As Benjamin leaves the shop he bids the statue of Chief Woodenhead goodbye, and is surprised to see the chief nod back at him. Later that night the Spruces are visited by 3 unwelcome guests, with Sam Whitemoon, Benjamin's nephew, as their leader, and things take a turn for the worst. This is a good little tale of revenge, with good performances from George Kennedy and Dorothy Lamotte as Ray and Martha Spruce, solid acting from the rest of the cast, and brilliant special makeup effects used to create Old Chief Woodenhead, which still holds up well today. This is the longest and my favourite of the 3 stories. The second tale is titled The Raft, based on the short story of the same name by Stephen King, which was originally published in November 1982. It starts with 4 young friends, Randy, played by Daniel Baer, Rachel, Paige Hanna, Deke, Paul Satterfield, and Jeremy Green as Laverne, as they drive to a remote area which has a large lake with a raft situated in the middle. One by one they swim over to the raft. Once they are on the raft, a rather strange and large oily mass starts moving towards them, and that's when their nightmare begins. This story is the shortest of the 3 and has some interesting and effective special effects. The acting and dialogue are okay, but are not on par with what we get in Old Chief Woodenhead. Still it's good enough, and just the right length to keep you entertained. The third and final story, like The Raft, is simply titled The Hitchhiker. This tale is about callous adulteress Annie Lansing, played by Lois Chiles, who while driving back from her affair accidentally runs over a hitchhiker, killing him. Instead of getting out of a car she panics and does a hit and run, but the hitchhiker, Tom Wright, keeps coming back again and again. Similar to the previous film with the lonesome death of Geordie Verrill and their creeping up on you, this story is primarily centred around one character, Annie Lansing. Lois Charles is good in her role, but there isn't really much tension to be found here. You can tell when the hitchhiker is going to show up. Sometimes it drags by maybe one scene too many, when Annie is trying to get away and or finish off the hitchhiker. Still worth watching, but I would say it's the weaker of the three stories. Watch out for the cameo by Stephen King. Personally, I would say that each story is progressively weaker than the last. Just like the original, they all have the recurring theme of being careful as your actions have consequences. The one you could say where the characters didn't deserve their grisly fate is in the Raft. For me, the argument could be made that Randy should have told the others when he saw the duck being killed and sucked down by the oily mass and suggest that they get out the water and leave, but he didn't, so there were consequences. There isn't a proper feel of continuity from the first film to this one. With the first film, it gives the impression that the creep is reading the comic and we, the viewer, along with him. With Creepshow 2, once everything becomes animated, we are given a sort of mini short story between each segment which centres around Billy. To be honest, it doesn't add anything interesting to the table, and on certain viewings it drags the film slightly. Instead of giving us these parts to fill in the time frame between each segment, they could have maybe given us an extra story. Yes, I understand that sequels have to also have their own identity, but they should have played on what people liked about the first, continued it and expanded on it. I like the live action version of the creep at the beginning and end of the film, but not the animated one. At the same time, he's not as memorable as the Grim Reaper look we get in the first. In 2 he's more of a ghoul, and there's no explanation to why he's different from the first film either. Michael Gornick had big shoes to fit into when taking over from George A. Romero for this sequel. His direction more than competently handles the film. Considering it's his directorial debut, low budget and tight shooting schedule, and at times seems a little out of his depth, it's still a bold attempt and should be applauded for his effort. Creepshow 2's score was co-composed and performed by Les Reed and Rick Wakeman. As I mentioned in my retro review of Creepshow, the score by John Harrison was done to perfection and is one of my all-time favourites. So how does this one fare in comparison? The score hits all the right beats and carries on the style that John Harrison uniquely created and cemented in Creepshow. Using a mix of both classic orchestral compositions and electronic synth cues, which work very well and fit the narrative in each segment brilliantly, the score is generally lighter than in the first. The first track, Welcome to Another Edition of Creepshow, by comparison has more of an uplifting feeling and slightly faster pace than the Creepshow Welcomes You, track 2 on the first score, which is darker and more dramatic I think. It's a great score, not quite as good as the first though. If I had to say, the score to Creepshow 2 is the best part of the film, by far. My final thoughts on Creepshow 2 are that it is not as good as the original. It lacks the blend of horror and touches of dark humour that the first balanced brilliantly. Sadly, there's an uninspiring wraparound story. The segments are not as good in this one and are progressively weaker, but that's just a coincidence of where they're placed in the film. The positives are that we get a great score, some good ideas explored and some brilliant special effects. Creepshow 2 is without question much better than the dreadful Creepshow 3. And from what I've seen of the Creepshow TV series, I'm hopeful, and with Stephen King's involvement it should be worth watching. When you put it all together, Creepshow 2 is a worthy sequel to the excellent original. A solid 90 minutes of horror fun, nothing more. It's like going on a ghost train ride. It has horror, but at the same time is not to be taken too seriously. Just have fun and be entertained. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed my review of Creepshow 2. Tell me what you think of it. Good, bad, somewhere in the middle? And if you're new to my channel, you can click subscribe and the notification bell so you can keep up to date with my latest videos. Thanks very much guys, and I'll catch you next time.